After a 9-month murder investigation into Stephen Hilder's death, police made a sudden announcement to the media.
The story appears to be heading for a new and dramatic twist. Perhaps it was Stephen himself who sabotaged his own parachutes.
It was clearly very difficult when the emphasis of the investigation switched from murder to possibly suicide, and we weren't surprised that the media picked up on that very strongly.
Those who knew Stephen best didn't believe that this video footage filmed immediately before his death could possibly be someone contemplating suicide.
He was okay. That was Steve. There was absolutely nothing there to suggest that he knew what was about to happen.
To me, Steve seemed perfectly normal before the jump. How he had been on lots of other jumps before.
I have watched that tape over and over again, and I have looked into his eyes, and even after the suggestions of suicide and everything, I can't see anything. That's just Steve. That's just Steve, being normal, like he always was.
We saw nothing that would give a hint of any change in his character. We don't believe it is in his character, so we're of the view that he did not take his own life.
When the inquest opened in March 2005, police were convinced that none of the earlier suspects was guilty of murder, and that Stephen had taken his own life.
I was satisfied and sure at the end of this investigation that nobody else was involved in Stephen's death.
There were a number of factors which lent weight to the theory that Stephen had committed suicide. First, there were his debts.
Steve was always very conscious of the fact that he was no good with money. It was like water in his hands. So although we weren't aware of the level of debt that he'd got himself into, we weren't surprised that he was in debt.
Stephen owed around £17,000.
I was actually really surprised when it was suggested that he may have committed suicide because of his debt, because he didn't seem that worried about it, and he was just like, yeah, no, it's fine, I'll get it sorted.
The coroner, I remember, clearly expressed the view that the level of debt, in fact, was not much greater than the national student average.
He knew that he was going to be in the military. He knew that that was a job for life. He knew that, with that sort of security behind him, wherever he was financially at that time, he would be able to fix it in the long run.
Secondly, Stephen was having difficulties academically. He'd failed some of his first-year exams.
I can't believe that he would kill himself because of his exams, because he knew how well he'd done, and he'd actually been thinking about it and had come up with a plan for what he wanted to do instead.
Stephen was considering a transfer to the Royal Navy.
He was certainly very positive about his career and the direction it was going in, despite considering perhaps a switch to the Navy, but it's still within the armed forces and the sort of life that he wanted to lead and the sort of things he wanted to do.
And third, the coroner heard that Stephen's relationship with his girlfriend was coming to an end. But at the inquest, she refuted suggestions that this might have caused him to have suicidal thoughts.
It wasn't a really serious relationship. It was just a casual thing you have at university. We were doing the play together for most of the time, so we see each other at least twice a week for rehearsals. Never saw him at weekends because he was always skydiving. We didn't really need each other all the time. He wasn't obsessed with me or anything like that. He wasn't needy. He wasn't demanding of my time or anything.
In any situation such as this, you'd expect personal relationships to be looked into to some extent. So, yes, it was a factor, but it was not one that was considered to be so overwhelming as to justify someone taking their own life.
And Stephen's conversion to Catholicism at the age of 17 meant that his religious beliefs weren't compatible with suicide.
He was extraordinarily passionate about the fact that he was a recent convert over to that faith, what it actually meant, what limitations that placed on his life, and why that was a good thing.
Jason and Stephen had discussed the obligations imposed on a believer. In the Catholic faith, suicide is a mortal sin.
We did raise the question of suicide, and it was something that Steve was very passionate about, the fact that, what gives you the right to take a life, even if it is your own life.
He did believe, and that, I think, would be something that would steer him away from taking his own life.
Motives for suicide were looking far from certain. The coroner called Peter Grant, the forensic expert on the case.
The coroner made it clear that he'd left my evidence to the end, as mine was the only evidence that could be interpreted as pointing towards suicide, and he wanted to hear everything else first. From my point of view, the forensic evidence we have, things like the fibres on the scissors, the DNA on the scissors, the fibres on Stephen's clothing, is entirely consistent with suicide.
But the evidence collected was to come under greater scrutiny at the inquest.
There's more than one interpretation to be put to those factual findings quite often, and that's really what happened when it got to the inquest. It was clear that there were different interpretations that you could put to the same facts.
During the hearing, new information emerged, showing that Stephen wasn't the only person with access to the scissors found in the boot of his car.
I'd known at the time that I was carrying out the examinations that Stephen's car was open, although the boot was locked. What emerged at the inquest was that the keys for the car were actually in the ignition.
So I would accept the proposition that, in theory, it was possible that a person could have gone into the boot of that car and could have planted some evidence.
The scissors, for example, could have been used by someone else to cut the straps if they were wearing gloves and then replaced back in Stephen's car.
Whoever cut the straps on Stephen's parachute would have created a cloud of fibres that would have settled on the parachute and on their clothing.
The fibre evidence has always been controversial, and I recognise that in us removing the parachute when Stephen's body was found, that certainly would have contaminated some of his clothing with fibres.
As the evidence was collected, fibres would have been spread over Stephen's jumpsuit.
We found a lot of fibres on the outside, as we'd expected, but then on the inside of the jumpsuit and on the clothing underneath, we actually found slightly more fibres, which, to my mind, indicates that Stephen had had quite close contact with the parachute pack after the straps had been cut. And the fibres on his clothing could have got there by him handling the parachute for some sort of pre-flight check.
At the inquest, it was revealed that Stephen had checked his parachute before he put on his jumpsuit. Having reviewed the forensic evidence, the details of Stephen's life, his state of mind, and the circumstances of his death, the coroner gave his conclusion.
Today, a coroner recorded an open verdict. Is this a mystery that will ever be solved?
It's quite clear what was done to the parachute, but it hasn't answered the question of when it was done or who did it, and for what reason.
Do I think he killed himself? No. But he's dead, and somebody did it.
It's very difficult to live with not having an answer. And I don't know how I'd feel if we knew what had happened or who was responsible.
It must remain a possibility that somebody knows what happened or more about what happened. It's not absolutely the end of the matter, and obviously we must hope that something does come to light. But it may well remain a mystery forever.